letting go. How to release the heavy vows that are suffocating you. Right now, a distinct localized sensation of deep internal binding or tightening is wrapping completely around your ribcage, making the breath feel short, shallow, and constrained, as if an old dry iron strap were being tightened around your lungs. It is the physical weight of a long-standing commitment, a heavy life vow, or an identity made in your past that has slowly become toxic, suffocating, and deeply misaligned with who you are becoming. You are lying awake because you feel trapped in a quiet, burning claustrophobia, terrified of the guilt and the judgment that might follow if you finally choose to alter your path. The mind is replaying old promises, counting the costs of walking away, and spinning an elaborate narrative that names you a betrayer or a failure, simply because your spirit has outgrown the structure you built for it years ago. In this quiet space, the immediate room around you is constructing a sanctuary of absolute, unmonitored privacy. The air has taken on a cool, fluid density, dropping toward the floorboards, while the scent of green willow sap and wet hemp rope settles quietly into the dark corners of the ceiling, far away from the exhausting friction of the day's obligations. Outside your window, a quiet night mist is gathering over the reeds of a slow-moving delta, cooling the earth and creating a profound, undisturbed perimeter around your bed. The smooth, stable support beneath your torso requires no defensive stiffness from your muscles. Tonight it does not keep a record of the contracts you have signed or demand that you maintain an unchanging form before the sun rises. There is no performance to maintain in this shadow, no relationship to stabilize, and no old vow to protect before the morning comes. You are not broken, dear friend. What you are feeling right now is not a sign of personal failure, nor is it proof that you lack integrity or the strength to honor your commitments. The tight, suffocating band you carry around your ribs is simply the natural consequence of a human spirit that has been forced to live inside a frozen contract for too long. Tonight, we will not force your mind to be silent, nor will we demand that you banish these protective anxieties from your thoughts. We will not treat your emotional claustrophobia as a defect that must be violently corrected, or your need to change direction as an enemy that must be punished in the dark. Instead, we are going to change the way your awareness holds this crushing sense of obligation, learning how to let the tight hemp knots unravel completely from your spirit so that the native flexibility of your heart can naturally return. There is an ancient, surprising insight within the Buddhist lineage that addresses this exact state of depletion. A commitment is a raft designed to cross a specific river, not a monument to be carried on your back across dry land forever. We overthink our old choices because fear convinces us that if we do not manually maintain the form of our past promises, our entire life will permanently dissolve into chaos. But this desperate internal bracing is not integrity. It is the very thing that turns an old direction into an artificial prison, rotting our deepest authenticity beneath a hard, crystalline crust of outdated loyalty. Peace is found not by fulfilling the old expectations of your social circle tonight, but by letting your awareness become completely porous, allowing your ribcage to expand like loose willow branches moving in a midnight wind. Maybe you have felt this too, during those heavy midnight hours when an old career path, a long-term relationship contract, or a private vow you made to your younger self feels like an immediate physical cage, an invisible cord that pulls the small tissue of your diaphragm into a tight knot of defensive readiness. If it feels right, take a slow breath into the absolute baseline of your lungs, noticing the simple, unhurried expansion of your chest and the way the air naturally recedes from your body without any intervention from your intellect. You do not need to force anything into a state of structural perfection right now, and absolutely nothing is required of you before the daylight returns. The life directions you are worrying about, the people you are afraid of disappointing, the hidden need to change that you have swallowed, to keep the peace, all of these things can exist exactly as they are without your active management tonight. You are safe enough to soften the tight binding around your ribs. When we constantly live under the tyranny of having to appear unchanging, our minds begin to resemble a tight sheaf of green willow branches bound together with dry hemp cords to serve as a riverweir anchor. Over seasons of high current and frantic containment, The bundle sits heavily in the riverbed, resisting the natural flow of the water. Because the branches are lashed too tightly to flex or put down their own roots, the bark underneath the cords begins to rot from the trapped moisture, and the wood turns brittle from artificial constriction. It looks perfectly stable, unyielding, and secure from the outside, but it is on the very verge of breaking into splinters, because it has been denied the simple mercy of moving with the river. The waterkeeper keeps tightening the hemp ropes, never realizing that the willow is dying from the inside out, not from a lack of strength, but from an excess of trapped tension. The waterkeeper is so consumed by the outward utility of the weir that he fails to realize a startling paradox. The bundle does not need to stay bound together forever to preserve its value. Its internal fiber can only remain integrated if the dry knots are intentionally cut, allowing the individual rods to uncoil, drift downstream, and find their own natural soil where they can grow into free trees. Your mind, in its habit of constant emotional buffering and holding on to outdated paths, has been acting as that bound willow bundle for years, trying to maintain an old version of your life to keep the peace for the people around you. You look for safety, yet the internal pressure only grows more punishing, not because you lack devotion, but because you are treating your own identity as a frozen contract that must never alter its shape. The suffering you feel tonight is the friction of that trapped growth, the tight, suffocating band of a body that is desperately trying to maintain a rigid, unpolished mask of absolute consistency while the interior is crying out for space. Let yourself notice that old habit of self-protection without judging it as a mistake. The instinct to honor our past choices even when they turn toxic is merely a deeply ingrained form of loyalty, a way the tired spirit tries to ensure stability when the world feels unpredictable and fragile. But tonight, that loyalty can take a much cooler, more spacious form. In a moment, our journey will take us down to a low-roofed wicker workshop built on stilts over a slow-moving, marshy delta, where an old basket maker and a simple crescent-shaped pruning knife will show us how to let the knots unravel without any struggle at all. For now, let your awareness rest within the simple, flat reality of your physical frame, allowing the tight constriction across your lungs to be exactly as it is, fully protected by the absolute privacy of the night. Deep within the low-roofed wicker workshop, built on heavy timber stilts over a slow-moving, marshy delta, where the endless fields of river reeds hissed softly. In the night, the air remained dense with the thick, pungent smell of green willow sap, wet hemp rope, and the cold mineral wash of brackish tides. It was a world defined by a constant, humid rhythm, where the mud beneath the floorboards sucked quietly at the pilings even as the rows of drying baskets radiated a faint, sweet scent of cut grass outward into the twilight. In this damp, isolated cavern of woven wood worked a young apprentice named Jiku, who carried an internal ache that made his lungs feel permanently bound, as if an invisible iron strap were being tightened around his ribcage with every rise of the river. For many seasons, his mind had been trapped in a quiet, exhausting vigil, holding onto a severe, unyielding promise he had carved into his heart years ago, swearing to maintain a complex network of village riverwares that his ancestors had established to protect the local fishing grounds. Jiku carried a secret, burning claustrophobia toward his own life path, and because of this habit of continuous structural loyalty, his chest was always rigid, holding back his own exhaustion to ensure that his community saw him as an unchanging monument of reliability. He lived with the constant anxiety that if he once altered his direction, or admitted that the work no longer fed his spirit, he would be seen as a betrayer of his family line. And whenever the marsh channels shifted or a fellow weaver suggested he try a new trade, his thoughts would instantly turn into a fierce internal court case, declaring that he must never show a single moment of variation, lest his whole world lose its orientation to him. A loose reed in the weir or a quiet urge to leave the delta felt like an immediate physical indictment of his integrity, a terrifying reminder that he was bound by an eternal contract that he had no right to renegotiate. At the center of this riverside workshop stood a massive low work table cut from a single slab of waterlogged oak, its surface permanently stained dark by decades of tannin and crushed bark. Working beside the bundles of raw material was Master Teshu, an old basket maker whose thumbs were crooked and heavily calloused from decades of forcing stiff willow rods into alignment, and who moved through the humid workspace with a profound, currentless density that required no spoken commands to maintain order. Teshu often worked in total, unbroken silence during the absolute peak of the autumn harvest, his large, scarred palms smoothing the rough shoots with an unhurried ease that Jiku found entirely impossible to replicate. Jiku watched the old man through the maze of drying wicker, unable to comprehend how someone could spend a lifetime twisting the same wood without absorbing its rigid, unyielding resistance into their own skeletal frame. Over months of maintaining the ancient marsh channels against the heavy battering of the autumn floods, several heavy sheaves of green willow branches had been bound together with thick, dry hemp cords and sunk into the mud to serve as a deep foundation anchor for the main river weir. Because these branches were lashed too tightly to move with the natural flow or put down their own roots into the silt, the bark underneath the tight cords had begun to rot from the trapped moisture, and the wood had turned brittle, groaning softly whenever the tide pushed against the unyielding containment. Jiku, struck by an immediate wave of structural panic during a high-water midnight inspection, noticed the faint, muffled splintering sound within the foundation bundle and grabbed a long iron bending lever, intending to aggressively tighten the hemp ropes even further to force the rotting wood to hold its shape through sheer constriction. The dull, wet creaking of the hemp rope against the stressed willow echoed sharply through the open slats of the workshop floor, each twist tightening the dry, suffocating band of tension around Jiku's ribs. He worked with a desperate, trembling velocity, trying to reinforce the ancient weir and smooth over the visible rot of the wood, believing that if the traditional structure failed for even a single season, his family's reputation would fail, and his loyalty would be proven a sham. The central timber frame began to shudder under the artificial tension of the cords, its joints groaning as the trapped growth within the bound branches fought against the unyielding twine. Master Teshu stepped out from the dark shadow of the soaking troughs near the water gate, his bare feet making no sound on the smooth oak planks of the floor. The old master did not offer an immediate lecture on the properties of wood or demand to see the weir blueprints. Instead, he walked slowly across the humid chamber, laid his cool, damp palm directly over Jiku's white knuckles, and gently stopped the young man from driving the iron lever into the ropes again. The only sound in the low wicker workshop was the heavy rhythmic lap of the river against the stilts and the rapid, shallow breathing of the young apprentice. Teshu did not look at Jiku's face. He reached out his other hand, took a small, crescent-shaped, bone-handled pruning knife with a curved blade from his apron, and held it directly over the center of the straining hemp knots with a slow, deliberate motion that completely defied the urgent demands of the midnight flood. Teshu did not add fresh rope to the bundle or try to shore up the breaking wood with iron bands. Instead, he slipped the curved edge of the pruning knife beneath the tightest cord and drew it upward with a single unhurried stroke, cutting the central hemp knot cleanly in two. The thick rope snapped open with a sharp, wet crack that echoed through the reeds, instantly releasing the artificial tension that had held the wood in its rigid cage for seasons. Jiku watched in absolute stillness as the green willow branches, freed from the crushing weight of the old binding, began to slowly uncoil, widen, and spread their limbs outward into the dark current. The individual rods were no longer straining against one another. They no longer had to maintain the performative shape of an ancient weir foundation, or hide the deep rot that had gathered beneath the twine. They simply floated loosely in the mud, their fibers perfectly secure because they were finally allowed to adapt to the true movement of the water. The old basket maker laid the curved pruning knife down on the damp oak table, its bone handle catching the low reflection of the oil lamp. In his low, gravelly voice, the master explained that when a willow branch has outgrown its binding, a waterkeeper cannot preserve its life by pulling the ropes tighter or forcing the wood to stay in an old arrangement through the winter. The pressure only turns the living sap into decay until the branch snaps into useless pieces. He told Jiku that a vow made to a river is a tool meant to help the people cross a specific season, not a permanent cage designed to suffocate the tree that grows beneath it. He asked the young monk if he truly believed he could honor his ancestors by transforming his own living ribs into a rotting weir bundle, crushing his own internal expansion, because he was too terrified to let the old knots unravel. In that quiet space, with the cool river mist settling softly over his chest and the tight constriction across his lungs turning into a soft, damp awareness, a profound wave of emotional recognition washed through Jika's torso. The frantic imagery of the village judgments and the family expectations vanished from his thoughts, replaced by the immense quiet relief of the loose willow rods floating freely in the marshy shadow. He looked at his own empty hands, then at the cut rope drifting away into the reeds, and he recognized the precise nature of his own emotional claustrophobia. The suffering he carried did not come from a lack of true integrity, nor did it come from the real changes in the river. The torment emerged entirely from his own habit of keeping the bundle tied at all costs, continuously hardening his own exterior because he was too afraid to let his life alter its shape in the quiet presence of the dark. The old master reached for a fresh handful of split reeds and began soaking them by touch in the long wooden trough, leaving the young apprentice alone by the open water gate as the last trails of fog drifted through the wicker walls into the evening air. In a moment, this low riverside workshop will bring its cooling draft closer to the specific emotional commitments of your own modern hours. But for now, let that image of the uncoiling, breathing willow rod rest within your thoughts, noticing how the deepest internal liberation always begins when we finally allow ourselves to cut the knot. This dark glimpse down into the fluid floor of the marshy delta is not telling us to abandon our practical responsibilities or stop caring about whether we keep our promises. It is not an invitation to become cold, entirely reckless, or completely indifferent to the survival of your household. Buddhist wisdom does not expect you to watch your life commitments shift or look at a difficult stack of old obligations and feel nothing but a blank, forced emotional vacuum. It is showing us something much quieter, something far more deeply protective of your remaining strength. It is revealing that the primary source of our exhaustion is rarely the simple presence of a changing situation or an evolved perspective, but the frantic, desperate way the mind holds those past choices, turning a temporary contract into a permanent indictment of our very right to breathe. When we look directly into this pattern, we can see how we continuously add a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply what life brings, an unreturned message, a sudden shift in an industry, a cold draft in the workplace or the plane, unpreventable reality that personal alignment fluctuates and flows on its own unhurried timeline. This first difficulty is clean, a natural part of navigating a physical world that has limits and changes constantly. It is the natural dampness that settles into one half of a timber when a river rises. But the second wound is the one we construct ourselves in the quiet hours of the evening. It is the heavy, suffocating internal narrative that insists an altered path means we are fundamentally inadequate, that we are failing compared to the visible stability of our peers, and that we must violently strain our own lower skeleton to force a state of permanent structural consistency before we are permitted to rest. This second wound is the bundle of jagged twine fragments and flat iron bands we carry up to the platform in a state of psychological panic, stacking false rope after false rope over our anxieties because we are too terrified of what will happen if the bundle appears loose. What we often describe as a necessary drive for loyalty in our modern lives is frequently the tight, suffocating grip of an anxious ego that whispers, if I do not manually control this calculation, if I do not stay awake to engineer a flawless solution for my future, I will be cast out into the cold and my life will be a public scandal. We treat an old promise as an absolute emergency that must be aggressively managed, a broken weir that must be forced into straightness before we can sleep. We become addicted to replaying our historic tracking, checking the stability of our social standing as if our constant internal friction could somehow shore up our external safety. But the great, steadying insight of this tradition reminds us that no external circumstance stays fixed in a single, predictable form, and that our desperate attempt to anchor our personal worth to a permanent, unmoving measure of consistency is what exhausts the soul. Life directions are fluid, they change, they drift, and they must occasionally face a lean season without our panic turning the delay into a personal failure. When we bring a soft, non-judgmental awareness to our survival anxiety, we are not trying to erase our practical needs. We are simply learning how to observe the cold throbbing across our hip joints without immediately running to grab another iron band. We learn to notice the impulse to calculate, to compare, to apologize for our timeline. And we let that impulse exist as a passing shadow that doesn't have the power to split our spine. Letting go, when understood through this spacious perspective, is never an act of lonely defeat or cold neglect. It is simply the profound choice to step down from the platform of comparison and allow your spirit to sit completely whole, right in the middle of an unfinished chapter. It is the realization that you do not need to solve the entire riddle of your material future tonight to be worthy of a deep, restoring rest right now. Your physical body does not require an immaculate record of constant wealth or social standing to possess its own native integrity. It merely needs to stop overloading its own housing with weights it was never tailored to carry. This flat mud floor that receives the timber is like the boundless space that surrounds the old wicker workshop, providing a quiet, neutral baseline where everything is permitted to find its own natural balance without any interference from your intellect. The ground does not demand that you level the beam before it offers its deep, solid support. It does not require you to accumulate a hill of gold before it allows you to rest your weight. It simply surrounds your existence with an immense, silent patience, allowing the false counters to fall away so that your true nature can touch the earth. When you allow your awareness to drop into this protective openness, you begin to experience a genuine, self-contained compassion. This compassion is the quiet capacity to meet an uncertain tomorrow without letting it dictate the security of your own skin tonight. It is the internal safety that allows you to look at your tired, defensive pelvis and recognize that you are allowed to unhook the bundle. Slowly, this ancient medicine becomes remarkably intimate as you lie here in the complete privacy of the dark. You begin to see that the cool, mist-like air settling into the room is not an accusation of your lack, but a sacred, unmonitored perimeter that has been drawn around your bed to let your lower torso expand in peace. The world outside is still spinning, entirely unbothered by the fact that you have chosen to step off the hook of active measurement for the next few hours. Your true value has never been a currency to be traded in the marketplace of public opinion. It is an innate, uncarved truth that remains completely untouched by whether you match the standard of your peers tonight. In a moment, our journey will take us down to a gentle inner practice, letting the natural drop of your breath release the heavy counters from your frame. But for now, let the exhausting need for calculation dissolve into the old wood of the room, knowing that your empty space is enough to hold the quiet. If it feels right, allow your internal attention to move downward, away from the busy, calculating space behind your eyes, mapping out the deep, quiet architecture of your mid-back and lower chest. There is no need to alter your breath with any kind of aggressive force or forced pattern. Perhaps you might simply observe the natural, cool expansion of your ribcage as the room's air enters, and the unprompted, heavy sinking of your shoulders as the breath recedes from your frame. With each slow, quiet exhalation, you might invite that distinct, localized sensation of deep internal binding or tightening, centered entirely around your ribs, to lose its tight, defensive grip. You are not attempting to achieve a perfect state of meditative clarity tonight, nor are you required to demonstrate complete mastery over your thoughts before the morning arrives. Even noticing the simple, dense warmth of your diaphragm as it rests against the support beneath you is entirely enough to begin sealing out the survival-level panic of the day. Right now, you might choose to bring a soft, non-judgmental awareness to that rapid, binding instinct that has been humming steadily within your thoughts since the evening began. Do not try to squash this internal containment machine with sheer willpower, and do not treat it as a personal flaw that must be violently corrected before you are permitted to rest. Instead, look at it with an open, spacious curiosity, the way an old basket maker might observe the loose reed fibers drifting across a wet wicker floor. Notice if there is a specific modern shape anchored to this physical tightness, perhaps an image of a past commitment, a quiet comparison against the visible stability of a colleague, or a persistent anxiety about whether your personal path will be sufficient to protect your household from an unpredictable future. As you witness this thought moving through your internal sky, you can gently name the emotional pattern without adding any layer of harsh self-criticism to its movement. You might silently tell yourself that this is simply the mind's old habit of tightening old cords, the terrified conditioning of the anxious weaver who continuously pulls hemp twine over the bundle because he is afraid of a shifting current. There is a deep, unhurried freedom in simply recognizing this reflex for what it is, rather than letting it dictate the actual tension of your bones. You are merely observing a protective mechanism that has run out of fuel for the night, an old piece of armor that has outlived its usefulness for these quiet hours. If it feels right, imagine yourself standing back within that low-roofed wicker workshop where the air carries the silent, stabilizing scent of green sap and wet mud silt. Picture your own internal alignment as that tight sheaf of willow branches bound together with thick, dry hemp cords in the center of the dark marsh channel. See the caked river mud that has settled into the wood during the long season of storms. And notice how an invisible, frantic hand has been continuously driving an iron lever into the ropes, trying to force a state of permanent structural consistency through sheer velocity. Now, instead of using your remaining mental energy to balance the environment or correct the shape of your life, you might simply choose to use the natural weight of your exhalations as a protective release. Imagine yourself letting those false weights, the social expectations, the outdated contracts, the constant demands for absolute consistency slip away from the binding knots of your mind. Watch them slide down one by one, losing their grip and unraveling harmlessly into the dark water far below your feet. There is absolutely no need to force this imagery, and there is no pressure to witness an immediate dramatic unlocking of your structural fears. You can simply watch as the knots fall away into the shadow, thread by thread, cord by cord, creating an empty, unmeasured space within your own chest that is completely relieved of the need to hold a frozen form. With every slow, unhurried breath that leaves your lower belly, picture the image changing as the central hemp knot is gently cut by the master's curved blade. See the old branches expand as they are freed from the crushing weight of the twine, allowing the individual willow rods to uncoil, widen, and drift loosely into the quiet current. The wood is no longer straining against its own growth. It no longer has to prove its consistency to the village or hide the rot it absorbed during the winter rains. It simply rests its full volume directly against the soft black river silt, its internal fiber perfectly secure because it is allowed to bend. Perhaps you can feel a subtle change in your physical frame as you allow this image to settle into your heart. The skin across your forehead and the deep muscles around your ribcage are letting go of the public counterfeit. They are dropping the performance of being perfectly unchanging, going entirely soft and open in the absolute privacy of your room. There is no longer an urgent requirement to solve the riddle of your material future or to guarantee your permanent alignment before the sun rises. The external river can hold its own weight, completely independent of whether you stay awake to monitor the weir tonight. You can return to this uncoiled, drifting baseline whenever you are ready, knowing that your inner world is fully permitted to touch the ground exactly as it is. What happens within your nervous system when you stop treating an old promise as an immediate emergency that needs to be answered by your muscles? Could it be that the safety you have been running yourself ragged to achieve is not hidden at the end of an idealized contract, but is quietly breathing right here, within the very skeleton you have finally allowed to sit flat beneath the water gate? Let your awareness sink into the deep, mineral immobility of this subterranean delta, allowing any remaining thoughts of obligation to float harmlessly across your mind like loose reed dust settling on an unmoving plank. In a moment, our journey will take us down to an old river meadow near a willow thicket, where the nature of this trust reveals a deeper, more permanent transformation. But for now, let your breath continue its quiet, open rhythm, fully protected by the darkness of the night. A mile downstream from the wicker workshop, where the marshy channels widened into a vast open river meadow. The delta revealed its rawest, most unvarnished landscape. Here the ground was composed entirely of deep, soft black silt that retained the footprints of waterbirds and smelled richly of damp bark, decaying reeds, and the cold mineral breath of the low tide. Across this wide expanse stood hundreds of ancient wild willow stumps, their thick, gnarled bases partially submerged in the mud, sending up clusters of slender, vibrant green shoots that vibrated softly in the autumn wind. This open meadow was the domain of an old willow grower named Rioan, a man whose skin had turned the color of cured timber, and who spent his solitary days cutting back the overmatured thickets to let the morning light strike the wet earth. He carried no grand designs for the delta, nor did he build structures to block the water. He simply tended the source, living in a small pea-thatched hut that seemed to rise naturally from the black soil. Jiku walked into this silent meadow carrying an even heavier, more complex layer of internal conflict than he had faced under the wicker roof. The emotional challenge had intensified an hour before, when a delegation of village elders had met him at the meadow's edge, holding an old leather-bound scroll that listed the traditional layout of the marsh channels. They had looked at the uncoiled weir bundle drifting in the shallows and had formally accused Jiku of gross negligence, demanding that he immediately gather 100 new rods, bind them with twice the amount of hemp rope, and restore the rigid boundary before the next high tide. The elders' voices had been sharp with judgment, warning him that if he permitted the natural channels to shift, the village's historic fishing rights would be permanently compromised, and his name would be recorded as the one who broke the ancestral line of protection. The accusation had ignited a fierce, suffocating panic within Jika's chest, pulling the tight bands around his ribcage so severely that every breath felt like a desperate scrape against raw twine. His mind instantly fell back into its old, exhausting habit of treating every external criticism as an absolute, unshakable truth, spinning a terrifying narrative that insisted he was a failure who had brought ruin upon his house. As he stood before the old grower, his knuckles were white as he clutched the heavy iron binding pins he had brought from the workshop, his jaw locked in a silent, defensive agony. He felt a powerful, desperate impulse to run out into the thickets, strip the wild stumps bare, and force the wood into an even tighter cage to appease the elders and silence the burning guilt that was suffocating his throat. Rioan did not drop his tools to console the young apprentice, nor did he offer a spoken protest against the narrow vision of the village elders. He was standing beside a long, hollowed-out log that served as a soaking trough, which had been set into the mud where a fresh mountain spring bubbled up through the black silt. Inside the trough lay several dozen unpeeled willow rods, submerged for days until their green bark had become entirely slick, slippery, and saturated with moisture. The old grower reached into the dark water, pulled out a single long unpeeled rod, and held it loosely across his calloused palms, letting the excess drops splash quietly back into the trough. He did not tell Jiku to calm his mind. He simply stood there in the gray mist, allowing the silence of the meadow to breathe between them for many unhurried minutes. The old man looked down at Jika's white knuckles and asked the young monk to take the slippery willow rod from the trough and bind it tightly to the iron pins he was carrying. Jiku reached into the water, his fingers gripping the wet, green wood with all the frantic force of his survival panic, determined to prove that he could still construct a permanent, unyielding alignment. But the moment he tried to exert his strength, the unpeeled rod, slick with its own internal sap and the spring water, slithered effortlessly through his tight palms, the rough iron pins scraping painfully against his skin without catching a hold. The harder he squeezed the wood to force it into submission, the more violently it twisted away, until his hands were raw and his breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Rioan reached out, took the iron pins from Jika's hand, and dropped them into the deep black silt, where they sank instantly out of sight. In a low, steady voice that carried the heavy immobility of the stumps, the old grower explained that when a branch is full of its own living sap and has been soaked in the spring, an apprentice cannot force it to remain a static, dead boundary. The unpeeled willow is made to bend, to slide, and to find its own relation with the current trying to grip it with a rigid, unyielding fist only tears the skin from the palm while the wood goes exactly where the river commands. He told Jiku that the village elders were trying to freeze a delta that had been shifting since the beginning of time, and that by treating their fear as a personal debt, he was turning his own spirit into a brittle, rotting cord. Standing in the soft black silt, with the smell of green sap thick in his nostrils and his raw palms cooling in the autumn wind, a sudden, quiet transformation occurred within Jika's nervous system. He did not achieve a state of magical, unblemished clarity, nor did he stop feeling the sharp ache of the elders' disapproval. The village's anger was real, and the consequences of a shifting channel would still have to be faced in the coming months. But for the first time in his life, he stopped resisting the reality of the changing river. He took a long, slow breath before reacting to the panic in his mind, and as the air moved through his lungs, he chose to sit down directly on an old willow stump, letting his weight sink into the soft mud of the meadow, completely exposed to the uncertainty of an unwritten future. He chose one small, quiet act of discipline. He stopped the habit of treating his anxious, defensive thoughts as an absolute reality. He reached into the soaking trough, picked up a single unpeeled willow rod with a light, non-judgmental touch, and instead of trying to force it into a heavy bound bundle with iron pins, he walked slowly out into an open patch of soft black silt near the main current. With a gentle, unhurried motion, he pushed the base of the single rod deep into the moist earth, letting it stand entirely alone in the open air, free to bend with the wind and free to put down its own independent roots whenever the tide rose. This was the subtle, lasting shift in how he related to his own suffering. He was no longer using his own ribcage as a shield to preserve an outdated framework of loyalty. He was allowing his identity to become as fluid and porous as the delta itself, recognizing that true integrity lay in honoring the living expansion of the wood rather than the static form of the old vow. He looked at the single willow rod standing quietly in the silt, and a deep, self-contained compassion filled his chest, not a sentimental emotion, but the steady internal safety that allowed him to let the village's expectations drift away into the rushes without destroying his own right to exist. As he sat beside the old grower in the deepening twilight, the tight, suffocating band across his ribs turned into a spacious, cool weight, a natural presence that required no confirmation from a leather scroll to hold its place in the world. In a moment, this quiet transformation will move closer to the specific, modern boundaries of your own evening thoughts, showing you how to let the old bundles unravel for good. But for now, let yourself rest within that open meadow, knowing that you are allowed to sit completely still in the midst of an unfinished chapter. The deep, quiet mud of the river meadow and the slow settling of the unpeeled willow rod provide a steady lens through which we can begin to examine the precise psychological architecture of our own modern suffering. When we feel emotionally heavy and unable to rest at night, our instinct is to assume that the external conditions of our lives are simply too intense, too chaotic, or too threatening to permit our minds to go dark. We believe that if our commitments were perfectly stable, if the people around us were entirely free from shifting, and if our personal history were guaranteed by an unyielding contract, then our inner world would naturally become quiet. But if we look closer into the dark spaces of our awareness, we discover a much more intimate, internal friction that has nothing to do with the external landscape. We find that our primary exhaustion emerges from our own continuous, desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable variables of existence, treating our own nervous system as an infinite barrier that must absorb every passing change to keep the world from moving. This compulsion to play the unchanging monument creates a subtle but devastating trap within the human heart. We begin to mistake a rigid, unvented resistance to reality for genuine spiritual grounding. When an unexpected difficulty arrives, a sudden emotional distance from a friend, a partner's changing needs, or the slow, unpredictable shifting of our professional calling, our immediate reflex is to tighten the muscles around our ribcage and swallow our own reactions to present a flawless, uncracked exterior to the world. We believe that showing our exhaustion or admitting our uncertainty is a form of betrayal, a dangerous exposure that will invite immediate chaos into our environment. Out of this fear of vulnerability, We begin to use self-judgment and shame as false mechanisms of self-improvement, continuously scolding our own tired spirits for feeling overwhelmed, as if we could somehow whip our hearts into a state of permanent, invulnerable consistency through sheer internal cruelty. Over time, this relentless habit of structural loyalty transforms our very identity into a suffocating prison. We no longer see our inner strength as a temporary response to a passing storm. We begin to define ourselves entirely by our capacity to suffer in silence, weaving our accumulated burdens, our unshared choices, and our historical roles as protectors into a heavy, rigid cloak that we are terrified to lay down. We become like the tight sheaf of willow branches that has spent too many seasons inside the rushing current, allowing the binding twine of everyone else's expectations to form a hard, crystalline crust over our natural bark. Because we have sealed our boundaries so tightly against the possibility of showing weakness, our internal core can no longer breathe or expand. The intense, frantic heat of our survival panic becomes trapped deep within our tissue, producing thousands of microscopic, psychological fractures that grind against one another whenever the room falls quiet. The timeless insight of Buddhist wisdom cuts directly through this exhausting pretense by introducing a profound, clarifying distinction between what is known as the first pain and the second pain. The first pain is simply the raw, unpolished reality of what life brings to our door. It is the natural, unpreventable friction of being a limited human form navigating a changing world filled with other limited human forms. It is the unpeeled willow rod harvested from the soft silt. It is the sudden, cold draft that enters through the wicker walls. It is the fact that the people we care about will occasionally make choices, experience sorrow, or pass through their own dark, unguided winters. This first difficulty is entirely clean and neutral, a basic condition of our shared existence that carries no personal malice toward your identity. It is simply the river current being strong as it leaves the marsh, carrying no inherent judgment of your capacity to bear its movement. The second pain, however, is the immense, suffocating layer of suffering that our own minds manually add to that initial wound through our frantic resistance to uncertainty. The second pain is the long, internal court case that insists your changed path is a proof of your own failure, or that an elder's quiet disapproval is an active emergency that you must stay awake to solve before the sun rises. It is the exhausting habit of replaying your past promises to see where your defense faltered, or continuously rehearsing future catastrophes to ensure you will never be caught off guard by a sudden change. This secondary suffering is the bundle of false twine and iron pins you pick up in the dark, trying to reinforce an ancient weir wall that is desperately crying out to uncoil completely into the mud. We cannot always control the first pain, because we cannot command the delta to stop shifting or force our loved ones to live without their own painful detours. But we can absolutely learn to stop feeding the second pain. True inner peace, when encountered through this spacious perspective, is never the magical elimination of all your real-world problems. Nor is it a state of frozen perfection, where your social circle never faces another shift. Genuine peace is simply a completely transformed relationship with those difficulties. It is the willingness to let an unresolved choice, an incomplete conversation, or a complex relationship contract sit precisely as it is on the damp silt of the present moment, without using your thoughts to tear your own chest open to fix it. It is the realization that you can care deeply about the people in your life, without gripping their destiny so tightly that you split your remaining strength. By refusing to treat your own fatigue as a moral flaw that must be corrected through shame, you allow the hard, dry hemp knots over your heart to naturally soften and unravel in the quiet privacy of the evening. When you stop treating every defensive, calculating thought as an absolute truth, the frantic internal forge naturally runs out of fuel for the night. You begin to see that your actual, physical presence does not require an immaculate record of constant, unyielding consistency to hold its place in the world. You do not need to win the argument of validation before you are permitted to close your eyes, and you do not have to guarantee the emotional comfort of your entire social circle to be worthy of a deep, restoring rest right now. The external current can hold its own weight, completely independent of whether you stay awake to monitor the twine. You can simply step out of the restricted cage of your old duties, letting your awareness expand until it matches the cool, porous density of a single willow branch left out on an open meadow ledge. As you allow these reflections to sink quietly into the deep tissue of your ribcage and midback, the tight, suffocating band of swallowed change begins to lose its sharp, electric momentum. The boundaries of your exposure are melting into the cool, damp air of the room, leaving behind nothing but a weightless, unburdened presence that is already deep enough, already safe enough, and already home in its own uncoiled center. The day is fully spent, the bundles are empty, the iron lever has been laid down, and your inner world is finally being permitted to turn completely soft. In a moment, our journey will bring this soothing medicine directly into the specific, fragmented settings of your modern daily life, showing you how to practice this porous openness when the morning returns. But for now, let your physical form become heavy and still, fully protected by the absolute silence of the dark. Now, let this uncoiled, flexible perspective step directly into the small, fragmented settings of your modern daily life. The wisdom of the river meadow and the loose willow rod is not an abstract philosophy meant to remain locked in a hidden delta. It is a practical shield that you carry into the exact moments when your day feels most frantic, bound, and exposed. It is practiced when you find yourself staring at an unmoving screen, waiting for a text response that does not arrive, and letting that silent glass interface determine whether your lungs are permitted to expand. It is practiced when you are lying awake at night, replaying a minor conversational misstep from 3 months ago, or attempting to control the fluid, changing dynamics of a relationship that has outgrown its old boundaries despite your best intentions to keep it anchored. We live in an era that mimics a tightly wound weir, a fast-moving space where we are constantly encouraged to display our personal consistency, our social commitments, and our continuous adherence to past agreements. You look at the visible, highly curated paths of those around you, and a sudden, dry knot whispers that you are lagging far behind, that you have mismanaged your emotional loyalty, and that your ordinary presence is somehow not enough to guarantee your safety. Out of a habit of survival, you might find yourself smiling broadly while carrying an immense, heavy sorrow behind your ribs, pretending to be perfectly okay for the benefit of family or friends, and then bringing that exhausting, rigid mask into your bed. You want nothing more than to drop the burden and rest. Yet the moment you try to settle, a persistent layer of guilt tells you that your quiet stillness is an unearned luxury, a lazy abandonment of your duties that will only cause the distance to grow wider. But the great, steadying relief of this ancient lineage is the realization that peace is never a public trophy you achieve by forcing every connection to look unchanging. It is a quality of unmonitored depth you bring to these exact ordinary seconds. It is the simple understanding that peace is practiced in small moments, when no one is watching the state of your boundaries. It is the brave choice to take a single, slow breath before answering an aggressive notification or checking your phone for reassurance, allowing your ribcage to soften before you pick up the iron pins of self-reproach. This deliberate pause is a profound form of wisdom, an intentional act of drawing the curved blade over the dry twine of your anxieties and letting the bound limbs stretch cleanly into the dark underground silt. Within this quiet sanctuary, you can begin to recognize that not every self-critical thought that crosses your mind deserves your absolute obedience, and not every frustrating feeling of guilt is a command that requires your immediate action. When your thoughts begin to spin an elaborate narrative about permanent failure or broken bonds, you can simply observe that movement as a drift of loose reed fibers passing over an unmoving oak table. You do not have to tighten old cords with bleeding palms to fix the structure. You can care deeply about the people you love, without gripping the line so tightly that it splits your remaining strength. By refusing to treat your changes as an active emergency, the frantic internal court case naturally runs out of fuel, allowing the fibers of your heart to expand naturally in the damp silence. You are fully permitted to rest tonight without earning it through a perfect performance or a guaranteed solution to your family's expectations. Your value as a living form is already completely established by the simple, quiet fact that you are breathing here in the dark, an uncarved presence that requires no external nod of approval to hold its place in the world. You do not need to possess an immaculate record of constant communication, a flawless history of showing up, or a life that looks perfectly aligned under the glare of public evaluation. The path your feet have actually trodden with all its unread entries, busy seasons, and silent gaps is the only ground that can safely hold your weight tonight. As you allow these reflections to settle quietly into your lungs, the internal pressure to fix your whole life before morning begins to drain out through the open spaces of your awareness. The tight, suffocating band behind your sternum is no longer a command to be managed. It is simply a tired muscle that is finally being allowed to submerge in the deep privacy of the night. You can leave the digital marketplace outside the heavy door of your room, recognizing that the distance between you and the world can exist without your active supervision for the next few hours. In a moment, our journey will reach its final, deep shaft, where all the remaining noise of the weir dissolves completely into a cool, currentless rest. For now, let your physical body become heavy and full, fully protected by the absolute stillness of the dark. The busy marketplace of your daytime consistency has completely cleared its stalls, leaving behind a vast, cool perimeter of absolute stillness that expands to fill every corner of your room. The long, intricate arguments of the mind, the persistent anxieties of your emotional loyalty, and the restless urge to fix old, rigid contracts have fully spent their electric momentum, dissolving into the quiet, dark space like dry reed fibers settling over an empty oak worktable. There is no longer a heavy iron lever to hold, no bound weir bundle to manage, and no slipping hemp cord that needs to be frantically pulled against your own strength. The entire architecture of your old worries is gently uncoupling itself from your awareness, leaving nothing behind but the slow, unhurried rhythm of a physical form resting securely in the horizontal dark. Let your body become completely heavy now, sinking down through the supportive layers beneath your spine, as if you were an ancient wild willow stump settling into the soft, black silt beneath the river meadow. The small muscles around your ribs, the delicate hinges of your breastbone, and the wide spaces across your mid-back are all receiving a total, unconditional permission to go entirely slack. Your breath has become remarkably quiet, a soft, effortless movement of air that requires no guidance, no monitoring, and no conscious intervention from your thoughts. The air simply arrives, fills the empty spaces of your lungs, and then glides away into the darkness, carrying the remaining grain of tomorrow's panic along with it. You are completely allowed to stop solving your life for the next few hours. The unreturned messages, the changing arrangements, and the incomplete ledges of consistency can all rest quietly in their dark channels without your supervision. The delta outside your window does not require you to act as an unyielding monument. To hold its place, it moves by its own ancient, organic flow, fully capable of sustaining the currents while you sleep. You have returned to the native sanctuary of your own uncoiled presence, a spacious, flexible home that has never been compromised by the rigid demands of past choices. Listen to the absolute silence that is growing between the slow movements of your breath. The dry gaps of old self-judgment are swelling shut through the quiet openness of your ribcage, leaving the inner channels wide, hollow, and perfectly clear. You do not need to be anything other than what you are right now, a quiet awareness resting in a dark room, completely free from the obligation to perform, to stay bound, or to justify your evolution to the coming dawn. The day is fully resolved. The knots are cut, the water is still, and you are unconditionally permitted to drop the final iron pins from your spirit. Let yourself slide effortlessly into the deep, unbroken stillness of a dreamless sleep, allowing your awareness to dissolve entirely into the dark, comforting expanse of the slow-moving river. What if the ultimate expression of your integrity was never the strength of the rope that bound you, but the quiet courage to let yourself drift into the soil where you were always meant to grow? This uncoiling is not a loss of your core truth, but a profound return to the pristine, fluid essence that formed your spirit long before the first social contract was ever signed in the valley. It is the complete restoration of the living wood, a gentle invitation for every compressed fiber within your thoughts to find its natural alignment under the soothing medicine of the night air. When the old twine is cut, the willow branch does not lose its character. It simply remembers the ancient, unyielding peace of the open meadow from which it originally sprang. In the same way, as you allow your internal tension to drop, you are not abandoning your capacity to care for those who matter to you. You are simply allowing the unvarnished reality of your existence to rest completely undisturbed by the frantic metrics of consistency. Let the slow, rhythmic movement of the dark tide outside your window guide your awareness deeper into the quiet corridors of your own chest. Each breath that enters your body is like the cool, mineral water of the marsh spring trickling over the unglazed willow bark, washing away the residual salt crust of old expectations and melting the hard, defensive boundaries you have carried for so many winters. There is no need to evaluate how well you are letting go tonight, and there is no ledger keeping track of how deeply your ribcage is relaxing against the bed. Even noticing the subtle, cool space that has opened behind your sternum is entirely enough to signal to your nervous system that the vigil has officially ended for the night and that the gates of the weir are wide open. This is the gentle reclamation of your native simplicity, the willingness to step out of the blinding glare of the public square and let yourself become completely anonymous in the deep shadow of the evening. The grand narratives of permanent alignment that kept your mind running in circles during the day are losing their sharp, distinct outlines, softening into the background noise of the night like the distant, occasional crunch of wet silt beneath a sliding sandal. You do not need to defend your right to be tired, and you do not need to provide a flawless justification to the dark before you are permitted to let your eyelids grow heavy. The support beneath your spine is completely solid, an unmoving foundation that has never required you to maintain an artificial resilience to hold your place in the world. As the quietness expands through the deep tissue of your lungs, imagine the physical imagery of the rock-walled meadow coming closer to your resting frame. See the flat granite ledges catching the cool moisture of the mountain fog, their ancient surfaces completely clear of the heavy wood boxes and iron tools that littered the afternoon. The unglazed clay trough sits quietly in the shadow, its porous walls fully saturated by the freezing water of the spring, completely empty of any active pattern or boiling friction. The lime wash along its rim is soft and damp, blending seamlessly with the dark contours of the marsh face until there is no longer a distinction between the container and the earth that cradles it. Your overthinking mind is adopting that same porous, currentless quality as you slide deeper into the horizontal dark. The persistent thoughts that insisted you must stay awake to protect your circle from a shifting channel are dissolving into the vast, silent space of your room, leaving behind nothing but a wide, hollow presence that requires no manual steering. You do not need to carry the memory of your past promises to prove your devotion, nor do you need to use internal criticism to correct your direction for tomorrow. You are fully permitted to leave the entire ledger of human dependency outside the heavy door of your room, recognizing that the world will continue to turn without your active containment, and that your spirit is unconditionally allowed to go completely soft. With every slow, unhurried exhalation that flows from your lower belly, feel the heavy, warm comfort of your physical form becoming entirely integrated with the stillness of the night. The boundaries of your old duties are melting into the cool air, leaving you completely roofless, an open structure through which the night wind can pass, without encountering a single point of rigid resistance or internal friction. You have returned to the only sanctuary that has ever been permanent, the deep, unmonitored baseline of your own breathing body, fully protected by the immense, non-judgmental mercy of the dark. There is nothing left to bind, nothing left to reinforce, and absolutely nothing left to solve before the morning sun touches the reeds. Let yourself drift away effortlessly into the heavy, rhythmic peace of your body, allowing your awareness to submerge completely into the dark, comforting expanse of a dreamless and unbroken rest. The day is fully spent. The bundles are loose, the iron pins are still, and you are unconditionally permitted to let the final tension die down into the quiet earth. As the silence deepens around your bed, feel the profound mineral security of the ground rising up to sustain your weight, fully trusting the subterranean vault to hold your spirit exactly as it is. an uncarved form resting deeply in the vast and open night. The vast density of the marsh walls holds your awareness now, a massive and silent perimeter that has no memory of the false masks you wore during the day, nor any anxiety for the shifts that may blow across the channel tomorrow. It simply surrounds your chest, reminding you through the unmoving frame of the room that the depth of your quietness is already whole, that the simple act of letting the bundle unravel contains all the spiritual grounding your heart has ever sought. The willow rod does not need to explain its curves to the night. It does not need to prove to the twine or the silt that it once held an intense, unyielding posture. It rests securely in its raw, flexible nature, completely saturated by the cool mist of the evening. And in that total openness, it finds an unshakable rest that no external evaluation can ever reach. Perhaps you can feel your own mind expanding into that same deep, spacious quality as you lie here in the complete privacy of the dark. The voices that demanded you act as an infinite barrier of consistency for everyone you love are losing their electric velocity, softening into the gentle background noise of the evening like the distant, quiet trickle of water, passing through the high reeds of a channel that is completely sealed away from your bed. You do not need to push those protective thoughts away, and you do not need to follow them into the dark corridors of old family worries. You can simply let them drift across the wide expanse of your internal sky, watching them appear and dissolve without ever letting them alter the steady, heavy posture of your rest. This is the deeper training of the spirit, the quiet daily willingness to allow yourself to be precisely where your bones touch the earth. It is the realization that your true value has never been defined by your alignment with past choices, nor has it ever been broken by the sudden modifications or unspoken needs that life has forced you to witness. The imagined blueprint of your obligations was only a map drawn by an anxious mind that could not see the vastness of the whole shifting river. It was a small, rigid scale that tried to turn a living spirit into a permanent wall of defense. By letting that map slip out of your hands tonight, you are not failing those who depend on your voice. You are finally allowing your nervous system to return to the only home that has ever been real, the absolute safety of your own uncoiled chest. Let the rhythmic movement of your breathing expand until it feels as wide as the entire delta at midnight. Each inhalation is a gentle, cool wave of presence entering your frame, filling the spaces where constriction used to live. And each exhalation is a deep, quiet release, a natural opening of the wood and fiber that allows you to sit lower and more securely in the dark. There is no effort in this movement, no striving to achieve an idealized state of meditation, and no pressure to heal your entire social circle before the sun rises. You are simply existing as a living form in a quiet room, fully supported by the flat ground beneath you, and fully embraced by the immense patience of the night. The heavy iron lever of your old expectations has washed clean through the open slats of your mind, leaving the internal channels wide, hollow, and perfectly clear. The machinery of your overthinking has finally gone silent, its heavy wheels resting peacefully in the dark shallows, no longer burdened by the weight of accumulated responsibility. You are an empty valley now, a beautiful, unadorned structure through which the quiet energy of the world can move without any friction or resistance. You do not need to hold on to your vigilance to protect your worth, nor do you need to use shame as a weapon against your own tired spirit. You can let the whole day go, recognizing that you are safe enough to drop your final defenses and slide effortlessly into the deep, dark expanse of rest. As the silence deepens around your bed, feel the heavy, warm comfort of your body, becoming completely integrated with the horizontal peace of the night. The boundaries of your exposure are melting into the cool air, leaving only a weightless, unburdened presence that requires no external nod of approval to hold its place. You are home in the only sanctuary that has ever been real, resting quietly under the unlit beams, where the fresh air of your life naturally merges with the boundless peace of the night. There is nothing left to steer, nothing left to calculate, and absolutely nothing left to solve. Let yourself drift away into the heavy rhythmic peace of your body, sliding effortlessly into the deep dark expanse of a dreamless and unbroken sleep, fully trusting the open ground to cradle you exactly as you are.